If you have a double sheet, you should possibly think about tearing it apart and giving one of the pages to someone who doesn't have notes, because they are identical. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Ian Aaronson. Who is, with good reason, one of our most popular summer school lecturers. His academic background is in pediatric urology, and he is listed amongst the best doctors of America. But to our great delight and benefit, he has turned his academic attention to art and the history of medicine. And every year we have this trouble of crowd control when he comes in. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Finola. Nobody told the fire marshal about the chairs in the aisle. Anyway, it's wonderful to see you all again. The microphone is working and not fading. How are we, Angus? Is that all right? Are we okay? No. Should we just play with the volume for a second or two, a bit of housekeeping, and get things... How is that? Is that... Are we... It sort of comes and goes. Frustrating. Do you want to turn the lights down? Yeah. Okay. So what we're going to do in this... is it fading again? It's maddening, isn't it? I'm sorry. What? Say again? Ah, thank you very much. That's wonderful advice. Now you tell me. Thank you anyway. Well, it's wonderful to see you all again. And when I say again, I see many, many familiar faces. And it's quite humbling to see such a huge auditorium. And I hope I don't disappoint you. Just one comment on the projection. Unlike in Middle Campus, where you remember last year we had one large screen which carried the light beautifully to the back of the auditorium. Here we're a little bit handicapped because the images are really quite a bit smaller, and I do apologize in advance, or rather ask the indulgence of the people sitting in the rear portion of the auditorium, because Monet, of course, is all about light, and if the light doesn't quite project as it should, it may seem a little flat. So I just ask your indulgence in that area. So then, this course, we're going to be looking at 6 or 7 different artists, all who have their own unique way of seeing either the world about them, within themselves, or society. And who better to start with then than Claude Monet, seeing the light. We're going to look at some lovely pictures, of course, but I'm going to go a little bit beyond that and actually present to you a hypothesis that the hard wiring of Monet's visual pathways within the brain, if not unique, was rare and highly developed, way beyond what any contemporary artist was doing. And it's because of that that we've got such brilliant paintings of his. So then, let's get underway. And in order to know, just to appreciate fully Monet's revolutionary contribution, we just need to be aware... What's happened now? Angus, come and rescue me. There we are. Not sure what I did there. In order to appreciate what Monet really achieved, we just need to look at what was going on in the art world around the time, the turn of the century, last decade of the 19th century. And this is... We'll turn the lights right down. Good. And this is a painting by the president of the French Society of Fine Arts, Pierre Puvis de Chevagne, a name you may or not familiar with, but he was really the record keeper and the torch bearer of classical painting tradition that carried right up to the beginning of the 20th century. And this is his view of the River Seine, and we can see he's rendered the trees quite beautifully, but for him, classically trained and the torchbearer for classicism, he has to populate his Seine view with these Greek goddess-like ladies. But for Claude Monet, that was completely unnecessary, because for his eye, there was more than enough in nature not to need Greek goddesses. What's happening? Are we...
Should I tell you completely?
Oh, bless you. Thank you for that. Is that better? You can see that. Oh, hallelujah. Thank you for that. Well, the painting speaks for itself, of course. Unlike Cubist de Chavannes, who needed to decorate with his Greek goddesses, more than enough was in nature for Claude Monet. And here we have a view of the Seine. We can see the light filtering through, the bouncing off the water, the ruffling of the surface of the water, breaking up the reflection of the willow tree, so the leaves seem to be vibrating in the water. So this was the gift of this man. He was asked, he subscribed to no theory of art. He was asked by a young lady who wanted to be a painter, Monsieur Monet, please advise me. And he says, my dear, when you go out to paint, forget what objects you have before you. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here a patch of red, here a streak of yellow. Paint as it looks to you, thus arriving at your own naive impression of the scene before you. And that's what he did. And here we see Monet taking his own medicine. And here we see his wife Camille Saint-Jean on a stroll through the fields with the poppies, as you can see. And his gift was somehow to convey movement in static paint. And I'll demonstrate that more convincingly with the theory behind it shortly. But I think you can almost visualize, if you glance at Camille, not directly at the poppies, if you glance at his wife, the poppies seem out of the corner of her eye to be slightly shimmering. And this is Monet's unique gift. And here is a painting which perhaps you're familiar with. It's a painting of the port of Le Havre, where the Seine opens into the sea. And he's captured this in a quick sketch, indicating the mist of the cold early morning mist, and the sun just breaking through to the point that you could almost feel the warmth of the sun. Not quite, but just beginning to feel that in the shimmering of the light on the water. Somebody who saw this painting was actually Alfred Sisley, a friend of Monet's, a fellow Impressionist, who said, what are you going to call this painting? And he said, I haven't given it a name, it's just a little trial of mine. He says, well, why don't we call it Impressions Sunrise? And that was picked up by an art critic in the newspaper who borrowed that name and said that this style of painting is so new, why not let us call it Impressionism after this painting, Impression Sunrise. So who was this man, Claude Monet himself, who had these remarkable gifts? Well, he was born in Paris in 1840, just 8 years before the 1848 revolution, when King Louis Philippe was deposed and a new republic was declared in France. And during that decade, it was a period of not only political instability, but also economic troubles. And Monet's father was a shopkeeper who was having a hard time with the economic difficulties. And he had a brother who worked in Le Havre, where we've just seen that painting. And his brother was a comfortably off ship chandler. So Monet Sr. takes his family to Le Havre, and that's where young Claude was brought up. Here he is at the age of 17. He went to school at Le Havre, and he was really a rather dismal pupil. And when it came to his baccalaureate, he was clearly struggling, and at the age of 17, his father took him out of school, despairing of what would become of this young man. His mother, sadly, died just at that time, age 17, and his father was unsure what to do, but recognized that his son did indeed have some talent. And his talent was for caricature, and this he did in high school. And this is his drawing teacher at school, Monsieur Hochard. And what an extraordinary gift this young man had. He was christened Oscar Claude Monet. And you may just notice right at the very bottom on the left of the screen there, his signature, O Monet. And that's how he signed his work. Well, his cartoons were so popular, his caricatures were so popular that family members wanted their caricatures done as well. And particularly the actors in the Le Havre theatre wanted to be portrayed in the costumes of the people that they were portraying on the stage. And he made a tidy sum of money doing this. So his Oscar, as he was then known, went to his framer to have some of these caricatures framed for the benefit of the actors, and there he was introduced by the owner of the framing shop to a distinguished French portrait landscape painter, Eugène Boudin. And Eugène Boudin was well known, well exhibited, and Boudin looked at Oscar's work and said, "My boy, you have some talent. Have you tried painting?" And he said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, why not come with me?" He bought him his first paint box, as it were, and together they went out on location painting scenery together. And that was Oscar's first attempt at painting at the age of 17 with the encouragement of Boudin. Boudin convinced Oscar's father that this young man clearly had talent. Do not despair of him, but send him to the Académie Suisse in Paris, which was not too demanding as to pedigree, so he was able to get in there without any problem. And there he spent 2.5 years learning the rudiments of oil painting. I don't know what he did for 2.5 years, but in that time there are only 3 paintings that have survived. And it seems that he spent most of his time in the cafes, bars, and cabarets of Paris. But this is one, and it gives you some indication of the talent of this young man. And you can see this is just his father rented for him a very small apartment cum studio in Montmartre. And there he painted the interior of this, as you can see. He was there for 2.5 years, and when the 2,000 francs he'd made from his caricatures was spent, he had no choice but to come back and think about a career. And as he got home, he discovered that draft papers from the French army were waiting for him. And he had drawn, it was done by lottery at that particular time, and if you drew a low number, you were drafted into the army, and if you were lucky and had a high number, you weren't. He had a very low number and was drafted into the army. His father was concerned and offered to buy him out, which was an option. But young Oscar at the time said, "Well, no, I think this will be something very interesting." And he volunteered for the African Chasseur Regiment stationed in Algeria. And he was attracted by the romance of galloping under the noonday sun and the cold desert nights. On his first leave, he came back and a friend painted him in his chasseur uniform very splendidly. And he later said that it was thanks to my experience in Algeria that I learned that the sharp light caused me to focus my attention on what I was looking at like I hadn't done before. So there's a little clue there. He went back in service, but at the age of 18 months he contracted typhoid fever and was invalided back home, and his father offered to buy him out the army a second time, and this time he accepted. But clearly with some talent, and the father said, well, it looks as though the boy may be able to get a job as an art teacher. So he enrolls him in quite a prestigious academy in Paris, of the Academy of Charles Blairs. And fellow students of Monet at the time were Renoir and Sisley. And so they were all the same age and all learning the rudiments of painting. And Blairs Studio was famous for its strict adherence to classical tradition, which is an important foundation for any artist, whatever you do later, of course. And here, on an excursion out into Normandy, this is the young 20-year-old Monet painting according to the prescription of his school, a classic farm scene, as you can see, painted with enormous accomplishment. Eugène Boudin, who had encouraged him right from the very beginning, a celebrated landscape painter, also painted seascapes. And this is an example of Boudin's seascape. And sadly, after only 8 months at Blairs Academy, Blairs himself contracted an illness which caused him to close the academy down. And so Monet, together with some of his fellow students, decided to spend the summer in Honfleur, which is just across the Seine from Le Havre. And there in Honfleur, Monet has his first attempt at a seascape. This is Boudin, and this is Monet. And I think you can see straight away that it's the light that attracts him, perhaps from his Algerian experience, perhaps intrinsic, probably both. How the light bounces off the clouds and you can see the yacht scudding across the choppy water there in the breeze. Looking for a guide, he was very taken by the painting of Edouard Manet, and 2 years previously, at the Salon of 1863, Manet had caused a scandal by exhibiting this déjeuner sur l'herbe. A scandal, of course, because we had well-clothed gentlemen sitting out having a picnic in a clearing in a wood with a nude lady, and this was absolutely scandalous at the time. I omitted to say that this picture that Monet had painted, there was visiting Honfleur, where this painting was actually exhibited in a small gallery for the tourists, I suppose. There was a visit by Johann Jodkind, a famous Dutch landscape painter who wandered in just to see what the locals were doing. And he caught a glimpse of this and said to the owner, "Who is this unknown artist?" And he said, "Well, it's Claude, now known as Claude Monet." And he said, "Well, tell him that he should submit that to the Salon of 1865, which he did. And to Monet's astonishment, it was accepted. Visiting the Salon was Edouard Manet, who 2 years earlier had produced the Déjeuner sur l'herbe for exhibition. And Manet looks around to see what's new in the Salon 2 years later, peers down at the bottom right-hand corner of the picture and sees Claude Monet. And this causes him to bristle. He says, "Who's this upstart with a name like mine?" Looking for a guide, Monet used Manet, who was a respected senior elder statesman almost at the time, as a guide for his style of painting, which he hasn't yet found himself. And he makes his own version, or at least plans to make his own version of Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This is not the finished work. This is an oil sketch that he did in preparation for a canvas which was going to be, can you believe, 18 feet by 15 feet wide, which was in fact twice the size of Manet's original. And you can see that unlike, if we just go back for a second and just look at this, a dazzling picture, one of the great icons of 20th century art, 19th century art, but compare that with the lighting instinctively that Monet does to a similar scene. And I think you can see that this man has got some hard wiring up here that other artists simply didn't have. He had to abandon his plans for this huge canvas because he wasn't a wealthy man, his father wasn't wealthy either, and there's no way he could actually afford a canvas that size, let alone the paints to cover it. So he abandoned the project, but this gives you some idea of the enormous talent he had. Looking for a subject again, he still remained faithful to his mentor, Edouard Manet. And here is his new girlfriend, Camille Dancieux, who acts as a model for him, incidentally becoming pregnant and eventually his wife 3 years later. And here is Camille. He paints her in life size. This is a huge canvas, 6 feet tall. And he paints her wearing a black velvet jacket with fur trimming, as you can see, this lovely dress in green and black, and she's adjusting a ribbon on her hair. And Monet is encouraged to submit this to the next year's Salon, 1866. And who should wander round to seeing what's new but Edouard Manet? And he looks down at the bottom right-hand corner again and sees, damn it, Claude Monet again. He says, damn it, he's not only got a name like mine, he paints like me. Which, of course, he did there. But now he's beginning to find his own voice. And I hope that projects well at the back with the lights out, and I thank you for allowing us to do that. It's absolutely stunning, I think, in terms just of visual impact the minute you look at it. It's the Garden of Saint-André, and you can see in the background the sea, the stiff breeze there that's pushing the smoke from the ships over towards the right. And you can almost hear the flap, flap, flap of the flags flapping against the pole there with the stiff breeze. In the foreground, we can see sitting in the chair there with his straw hat, Monet's father. with his aunt under the parasol next to him. And what's dazzling about this is not only the light bouncing off the flags and the dress and the parasol, but the brilliant reds of the gladioli, the nasturtiums, and the geraniums there against the green. So clearly he's got a gift for colour and light that we really hadn't seen before. Now he's exploring, he's trying to find his own voice. And here in the little village up the Seine of Bennecourt, he's experimenting with the effects of light and dark, the dark leaves, as you can see, and the light, and also exploring for the first time the effect of reflections in the water. It's an unfinished sketch because there's no reflection of the houses on the right there, but nonetheless you can see what he's striving to do. And there is his wife, now wife, Camille, sitting there as the model on the bank. As I said, in Blairs Academy, there was not only Alfred Sisley, but also Renoir, who was a fellow student about the same age. And Monet and Renoir became great friends. And they decided to go off together to do some painting. And they went to a bathing resort on the Seine, a little downstream from Paris, called La Grenouillère, sort of the froggery, I suppose you would translate that as. And the two of them sit down side by side on their camping stools with their easels, with their canvases and their paints. And here Monet paints the scene as a sketch, not a finished painting, but just as a sketch, quickly done over an hour or so. And what he's captured here, we can see in the center there, that sort of round area is a little bathing station. And to the left of them, you can see some bathers in the water. And to the right, you can see a floating restaurant, which is a feature of the resort. But what Monet has done for the first time, captured the light as it hits the little wavelets as they sort of come in towards the shore, so that you can almost hear the sort of pat, pat, pat of the little wavelets hitting the underside of the rowing boats there. At least that's how I sense that. And meanwhile, sitting next to him, doing exactly the same scene, was the famous Renoir. And what's so interesting about that, the great Renoir, to become, is much more interested than the dappling effect of the water. In fact, his water looks a little bit dull in comparison. I mean, it sounds sacrilegious to say, but how can you compare the two, at least to my eye? But what Renoir was more interested in, I think, was simply the dappled light effect on the gowns of the ladies there. But you can see that even the famous Renoir had met his match, if not somebody who exceeded it. It's now 1870. The Franco-Prussian War has just started to great ballyhoo, and the French were anticipating a great victory in a matter of weeks, keep the Prussians in their place. And of course, just the opposite happened. Paris was under siege, and the Monet family living in Le Havre were afraid that the Prussian forces would actually advance to the Channel and Normandy. And so they hot-footed it across the Channel to London, and there they sat out the duration of the Franco-Prussian War, Monet doing his first of his London scenes on this particular occasion, fascinated by the mist that seemed to hang over the river. He wasn't the only one to hot-foot out of France during the Franco-Prussian War, because he met there the distinguished, who would become famous French dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, a name to be conjured with, as we'll talk about a little bit later, who was actually primarily responsible for putting the Impressionists on the map, as we're going to see shortly. So he met Durand-Ruel, who was opening a satellite gallery in Old Bond Street in London, in addition to his gallery in Paris. And of course, nobody was buying pictures during the Franco-Prussian War in France, so he was trying to earn a living by taking some paintings to London. And it was Durand-Ruel who introduced Monet to Camille Pissarro, who was also escaping the war, living in Norwood, just north of London. And Monet and Pissarro hit it off quite beautifully. They both had the same sort of aesthetic and were painting the same sort of things in their individual ways. And they took advantage of being in London by visiting the gallery. And they went to the National Gallery in London, and they saw Constables Highway painting. And Monet was particularly struck by the way that Constable had used little abrupt brushstrokes to create his trees, and evoking quite beautifully his native Suffolk. He also saw there Turner's Rain, Speed, and Steam. Rain, Smoke, Rain, Speed, and Steam. Yes, I did get it right, sorry. What Turner was interested in, of course, way ahead of his time, to a dazzling effect, created this atmosphere, quite unique. And Monet was highly impressed with this and thought, well, there are lessons to be learned there. Back after the war had finished, they had a little sojourn in Holland on the way back, and then back in Paris. They moved from Le Havre, they moved to the little town of Argenteuil, which is 10 kilometers north of Paris. And there he was able to rent, because he was selling some of his paintings now, and he could afford, with Camille and their Saint-Jean, who you can see there, to rent this quite large house with beautiful picture windows there at the bottom, which served as a lovely light-filled studio for Monet. It was a happy time, and he painted his son on the left there. This is young Jean on his hobby horse tricycle, the young prince. And I cannot believe he wasn't aware of Velázquez's painting on the right of Prince Carlos Balthazar, the son of Philip IV of Spain, as a tribute. So two princes, if you like, on their own vehicles. Out walking, he used Camille as his model. We saw her, the lady with the green and black dress, of course. But here's Camille now out walking, and as they're walking, Monet is always carrying his easel and his stool with him and paints with him. And he says, stop. And he says, turn round and face me. And he does, and there she is, Camille, with her parasol facing her. And what is extraordinary about this painting is that most painters, in fact just about all painters, would paint their subject either in full light or oblique light. But what does Monet do here? He paints into the light. And it's that dazzling effect of the light coming from the sky, which I think you can see there, that can only be Monet. There's nobody else who could paint like that. He bought himself a boat on the Seine and turned it into a studio so that he could go up the Seine and watch the changing effects of light on the river. And this was one of a series of paintings that he did, about 20 or 30 sketches in his boat of the Seine at different times of day. Durand-Ruel, whom he had met in London, you remember, knew that this was a young man to be reckoned with and sought him out in Argenteuil and went to his studio and bought all 29 paintings that he had done of the Seine scenes. He's a great hero of mine, Durand-Ruel. He nearly went bankrupt twice promoting these people. He bought all these paintings that nobody had ever heard of, which were being criticized in the press as ridiculous and whatever. And he didn't really have any prospect of selling them, but he just had an instinct that this was the way of the future. And so he bought all these paintings that Monet had done. And as I said, Monet, Argenteuil, where they were living, was just 10 kilometers north of Paris, served by an hourly train service, which brought the passengers into Gare Saint-Lazare station. And there, Monet was absolutely fascinated by the smoke of the engines coming in and out, hauling their trains. But unlike Turner, who was concerned with a global atmospheric effect that we saw just a moment ago, what fascinated Monet was the way the smoke issuing from the chimneys of the engines dissipated into thin air, as if it was moving. We've all seen that, but if you cast your mind back to where you've observed that yourself, it's quite magical, isn't it? It belts out a great ball of smoke coming out of a chimney and then slowly dissipates. In fact, you see it in the tablecloth over Table Mountain sometimes, don't you? That same phenomenon of cloud dissipating. And this is what really fascinated him. So this brings us to really the heart of my hypothesis, and that is that the wiring of Monet's brain was quite different from any contemporary painter. So what do I mean by that? Well, light, of course, reaches the eye, and those of you who've been to your optician recently will know that on the left-hand circle there, we're looking at the ophthalmologist's view of your fundus through his ophthalmoscope. That little yellow area to the right is the optic nerve, and we can see the blood vessels. What we're looking at is actually the light-sensitive membrane at the back of the eye, called the retina. And diagrammatically, the retina is represented by that diagram on the right-hand side. Right at the very, very bottom, we have the rods and cones in orange, as you can see, which are sensitive to light and dark, and the cones that are sensitive to an almost infinite range of colors. And the job of those cells is to convert the energy of the light which arrives on those cells into a minute electrical current which stimulates the connection to the black cells there, the bipolar cells, and onwards to the beige cells, and then into the optic nerve itself, which then carries into the brain. So that's the basic anatomy of vision, which I'm sure you were familiar with anyway. Oh, come on now, of course you were. We used to think that the pathway from the retina to the brainstem, as they called it here, or the midbrain, arrived at the back of the brain, which is over to the right-hand side, where the grey and red lines sort of fan out. And that's called the occipital cortex, the occipital lobe of the brain, the back of the brain. And it's been known for a long, long time that that's where vision is recreated from the impulse arriving in the retina. Very simple pathway. We now know that that is a great underestimation of actually what goes on in the human brain to see. And that, for the moment that the light images converted into little electrical currents go into the optic nerve, they're already segregated into two distinct pathways, represented here by red or grey. The red pathway is concerned with identifying what the object is that we're actually looking at. And those pathways actually are not in the occipital cortex. The pathways start there and then radiate out and go to many different parts of the brain that we never really thought had anything to do with vision at all. And when I say the what system there, it's the ability to recognize that is a house, that is a face, that is a tree. So that pathway recognizes that, and it recognizes it because the nerve cells are connected to other nerve cells where memory is stored. So you remember that you saw a tree in the past, and this looks like that, so you say that is a tree. This is very simplistically, and that's as far as I can go because I'm not a neurophysiologist, but very simplistically, I think you can understand the principle involved here, that the brain is interpreting what. But now there's something much more interesting, and this is where Monet, I think, is endowed, if not uniquely, at least with great hypersensitivity, and that is the grey pathway going up to the top of the screen there, the where system. And that pathway is responsible for not identifying what the object is, because you now know what it is, but what is the relationship of that object to its background. And if it seems to be a constant relationship, you say that it's static and it's a still thing. But if it's constantly oscillating and you're not quite sure, the brain interprets that as movement. And this is what I think was unique about the brain of Monet. Unique is the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Something special about this man's brain. These pathways are not just fanciful creations in an armchair. They've been dissected out by the anatomists, so you can see these pathways, the nerve bundles going. And here we have a functional MRI scan of a brain of a volunteer asked to look at one moment at a stationary object and at the next moment at a moving object. And to everyone's surprise, huge areas open up. All the colored orange areas is where there's physiological activity going on in the brain, responding to the request to look at those objects still and moving. So clearly it's not just the visual cortex, which is way over on the right-hand end of the screen there, is that little area. So Monet didn't know any neurophysiology, needless to say. But what he did discover intuitively was that if you paint an orange object, remember we looked at this earlier, how it seemed to be like a ball of fire hanging in the sky and you could almost feel its warmth. He discovered purely intuitively that if you paint a colored area, the same brightness as the background, and the terminology is luminance, but you don't worry about that. But if you paint a colored object as the same luminance or brightness as its background, and that's difficult to assume that by looking at this because we're not used to looking at luminance in color. But if you do that, that object, colored object, seems to vibrate. It's as if that pathway of the brain is a bit confused because the brightness is the same, and it gets a bit confused. And he discovered that phenomenon here. And to prove that that is the case, you would say, well, if you wanted to make the sun look bright, why don't you just give it a bit more yellow in your palette and make it look a bit bright, or add a bit of white to it, and surely that will make it look bright. Not so. Counterintuitively, opposite is true. And the proof of that is the top picture here. This is the same picture that we just saw with the red ball of fire and the little reflection in the water there dancing around. It's a photograph taken in black and white of that same painting. And this is the proof. Where's the sun? It's gone. Why is it gone? Because it's the same brightness as the background. There's no color to give it away. So Monet had discovered that if you paint that color the same brightness, it has this vibrating effect. And you say, well, all very well and good, but why don't you just make it brighter anyway? And that's what we've done in the bottom picture, electronically enhanced the yellows and oranges in the picture, leaving the others alone. You do that on a computer very easily. And if you do that, well, there's the sun, it's reappeared. But would you agree with me, it doesn't quite have that vibrancy that orange, I didn't want to take a show of hands whether you agree with me or not, but I'm convinced it is. And don't forget, we're looking here at projection of a photograph of a painting. So I'm excusing myself if you're not convinced. But if you look at it in the real, it is absolutely convincing. He discovered a second phenomenon purely empirically, just on his own intuitively. And that phenomenon is that if you draw a succession of curved lines, the distance between which gets shorter and shorter and shorter, there comes a point when suddenly the thing seems to be fuzzing in and out. Does that pick up on the screen there? I hope it does. And that phenomenon is actually enhanced if you add yellow, black, and blue. And this is a physiological chart designed by a Japanese psychologist to make that point. He called this dancing snakes or something like that. You can find this in a book of optical illusions, if you like. But that's a phenomenon that the eye, can you see that? It's really quite striking, isn't it? And Monet hit upon this without even knowing it. And here we are. And here we have a train with the same colors, the mustard yellow, the blues and the blacks, a train going over a bridge, and here's the smoke coming out, dissipating. And furthermore, you can see that as these little wavelets get further and further away, those distance between the curved lines get shorter and shorter and shorter. So he's halfway or a third of the way towards reproducing that optical phenomenon we just looked at. He had no idea he was doing that, but this is the degree of refinement of his neurological pathways, I think, that allowed him to do that. And what about movement itself? Well, if you ask an art historian what's the painting that depicts movement more than anything else, it's this painting of the rape of the Sabine women, painted 17th century. And at first sight, it's absolutely full of movement. Or is it? And if you look at the individuals moving, they're frozen. They're suddenly frozen. So it's not a picture of movement, it's a picture of stillness in poses. I think that's probably not a very generous way of describing it, but nonetheless, it's not movement. And as far as Monet was concerned, he discovered a third phenomenon, and that is the phenomenon of peripheral vision. And here, we're looking at the Rue Montoré in Paris in about 1878, when Paris had recovered from the defeat of the Franco-Prussian War. It was a fête nationale. Everyone had to put their flags out. And if you concentrate your gaze on the throng of people in the street there, not looking at the top and sides, as you look down there, it's difficult not to think that the flags are slightly wavering. I won't convince you of that, but I leave it to you to say whether that's true. But let me say, if you stand in front of the real painting and do that, it does that, absolutely. Monet was sufficiently, he was all right. He reached the point now that he was sufficiently established that he had some private customers, one of whom was Ernest Hochaudet, a Parisian businessman who bought many of Monet's works. And here he is. His wife Alice is not in the picture, but here he is with their four daughters. And Hochaudet was a great supporter of Monet, and at this particular time, Monet was unable to renew the rent on his house in Argenteuil, where he'd painted Jean sitting on his tricycle, you remember. And Hochaudet said, well, I've got a country house in Verteuil, which is not very far away. The house is much too big even for us with our 4 children. Why don't you, Camille and Jean, come and live with us until you get your housing situation sorted out? Which he did. And unfortunately, things went badly for business of Hocheday, and before long he was bankrupt, and unknown to Monet, there had been marital troubles, and the couple actually separated, Ernest going back to Paris to live in his own apartment, leaving Alice and the four girls in the big house with Camille, Monet, and Jean. And at that time, Camille gave birth to their second child, but postnatally things didn't go well, and she was unwell and remained progressively unwell over many, many months. And eventually, she died. And the diagnosis was an ulcerated ulcer, which was probably carcinoma of the cervix. One would suspect it was too long a distance from the birth to be postpubertal sepsis. And Monet felt compelled just to do this sketch of Camille on her deathbed shortly after she passed away. They were very attached to each other, and as an artist, I think this was like his last tribute to her. So there was Alice Monet, now only 39 years old and a widower, with young Jean, and Alice was on her own with her 4 children, her husband having abandoned the family, basically. It was a hard winter. Everything was very sad. Camille had died. And here Monet paints this main street in Verteuil, as you can see there. But as luck would have it, the two, Alice and Monet, developed a relationship. They became very fond of each other and ultimately were to marry. And so with that new lease of life following the death of Camille, Alice, Monet, and all 6 children now went to Vangeville on the Normandy coast, and you can see that his palettes brightened up instantly, the church on their court in the early morning sun. And there was plenty for Monet to paint, lovely seascapes as well, with interesting sculpture. Among they really had to find somewhere to live, and it was clear that Alice Hecheday and Claude Monet were going to get married, and so they were thinking, where can they get a house that was actually big enough for them all now? There was a big family. And they rented a house where the river Epte in Normandy meets the Seine, at the tiny village of Giverny. And they rented a large house, big enough for them, and in the garden they could see, there is a picture of some of the children. Monet was particularly attracted to Alice Hecheday's eldest daughter, Alice, who's wearing the hat there, because she physically resembled so much Camille. And so much so that he went out walking with her and put her in a dress the same as he'd painted Camille 10 years earlier. And this is now Suzanne, the daughter of Alice Hecheday. Isn't that interesting? And there she is, the same backlighting as a tribute in a way to his memory of his wife. Looking out of the back, this is a photograph taken from the back of the house at Giverny, and it looks over a field where there were grain stacks. These are called popularly hay stacks. They're not hay at all. This was actually the wheat harvest, which was gathered waiting for the threshing machine to come and thresh. And it often took many weeks and months as it went from village to village to thresh the farmers' wheat. And so these wheat stacks were often stacked up and remained often till the spring. And this is a photograph taken, and you can see at the back there a row of little cottages, and that's the photograph. And Monet was fascinated by the changing effects of light. And you can just about make out at the extreme right end there the little cottages that we just looked at in the photograph. And here Monet takes his stool and his canvases and his easel and commandeers the Hecheday children to push a wheelbarrow containing 20 or 30 blank canvases on which he can paint. And he spends most of the day out there in front of these, looking at the effect, here with the midday sun, as you can see, glancing off the left-hand side of the grain stack there. And here, later on in the day, he observes that as the sun goes round, the shadow behind seems to become blue. These are just rough sketches that he did at the time. And here again, a phenomenon that we've all experienced if we happen to look at the setting sun, just momentarily glance at it as the sun suddenly disappears behind a hill. As the orange disappears, suddenly everything looks green. It's a sort of optical phenomenon of compensation in the eye. And Monet obviously is hypersensitive in this area, because this is not a flash, but you can see the hill now and everything has become green, even green on the grain stack itself. So he's really clearly got hypersensitive visual pathways. Along the river Epte was a stand of poplar trees. And in its wisdom, the elders of the village of Giverny wanted to put these trees up for auction to raise some revenue. And Monet said, oh, not so fast, I want to paint these trees. And he came to an arrangement with a local timber merchant that at the auction, if the hammer price went above the maximum bid of this particular merchant, Monet himself would make up the difference on the condition the merchant agreed to let the trees stand until he finished painting them. And there he did, and this is just one of about 20 pictures that he did of a series of poplars. So I told you that Durand-Ruel was a great hero of mine, and here's the man himself, having bought up not only Monet, but Renoir and Sicily and Pissarro, wanting to promote them. But how do you sell paintings that the art critics in the newspapers are panning as absolutely outrageous and whatever? And he had a trick. And his trick was to furnish his own apartment as a second gallery. And if somebody showed an interest, remotest interest, or even without an interest, he said, come and see what I have, and see it in a domestic setting, and see if you'll be convinced this might be suitable in your own home. And he went one step further, which was all unprecedented at the time, saying, if you really like the painting, please take it home. And if you don't like it, bring it back, no charge. I want you to be happy with it. And it worked. And it worked. And that's how Impressionism took off to be the #1 art medium, I suppose, crowd puller in all the exhibitions in major museums around the world. This is the difficulty that Durand-Ruel had. This is a landscape by Corot, with its historical overtones with the castle in the background, painted just a few years before Monet. And this is what the customers were actually spending money on. And Durand-Ruel's task was to convince them, instead of that, go for this. Difficult task, I think you would agree. And instead of Jean-François Millet's nice pastoral scene of sheep grazing in front of grain stacks, he said to his customers, why not be adventurous? Take this and see how this looks at home. And that's how he did it. And the rest, of course, is history. Around this time, Monet's father died. And that brought him closer to his brother, who was living in Rouen. And so he paid several visits to his brother, and he was absolutely fascinated by the intricate stone carved work on the west face of Rouen Cathedral, seen in this photograph. And he was so fascinated by it, which seemed to change colour with the times of day, that he rented a room opposite the cathedral west door across the square, and on 2 or 3 visits over 2 years, sat there throughout the day, different days, painting various aspects of that face. And I'm going to show he produced about 40 or 50 of these. So I'm just going to show you a quick montage of 4 of them. On the left-hand side, early dawn, midday next to it, and then towards the setting sun, and then even in fog. You need to see these as a whole array in a museum. Buying one misses the point in a way. So if you're going to invest in Monet, I'm afraid you've got to buy 6. Monet himself was very reticent to have these paintings exhibited. He kept saying, these are just experiments, which is lovely. But his dealer, Durand-Ruel, said, no, they're not experiments at all. And the next year, he persuaded Monet to assemble 18 of these. Let me add that all of these paintings that we've looked at so far were the original sketches that he did on site. But what is not widely known, and it came as a surprise to me, that he went back to his studio and worked them up and worked them up and worked them up. So to say that it's all plein air painting, that's what Impressionism is all about. They start off plein air painting, but they work them up, that's for sure. Anyway, so eventually he works up 18 paintings that he thinks are worthy of exhibition, and only in France will an art review appear on the front page of the national newspaper. And of course, it was a sensation. Tout Paris came to see. In fact, probably toute la France came to see, and it was a sensation. And from now on, Monet had financial security. With that financial security, he was able to make an offer to the owner of the house in Giverny, where he was living with Alice and all 6 children. The owner agreed to sell, and he therefore made an outright purchase of the Giverny house. Not only that, he was able to purchase adjacent fields and arrange for a stream to be diverted so that he could greatly enlarge the lily pond, which was to be the focus of his life for the remaining 20 years. There, incidentally, holding his hands in his waistcoat there with his straw boater, is Paul Durand-Ruel's son with his own family, because they were frequent visitors. Sadly, just about this time, Suzanne Hecherday, whom we saw posing like Camille with her parasol against the sun, died suddenly after a very short illness of just a few days, aged 30. Alice was distraught, and Monet thought it would be a kindness to take her out of that environment after an appropriate period of mourning, and he took her to London. And there, Jean, the little boy that we saw on the tricycle, was actually learning English and actually living in London, so it was a good opportunity to re-establish contact with his son. And those of you who know London will recognise St Clement Danes, the Royal Air Force Church there on the left there. This is looking down Fleet Street, and then towards the right of the picture, going off out of the field, is the Strand. And just to the right of the Strand is the little road that leads, little entryway that leads to the Savoy Hotel. And Monet, now being able to afford the Savoy Hotel, which is more than I can do, he was able to take a room for several months on the 6th floor overlooking the Thames. And there, he painted the view of the Thames, looking at the Charing Cross railway bridge, and beyond it, Westminster Bridge. And in the very, very early morning mist, you can just about make out the Houses of Parliament at the distance on the right-hand side. And as the sun came up, things changed, and here he does another sketch. These are all quick sketches, sketch of the lighting as it changed. And as the sun moved round, he crossed the river and installed himself on the terrace of St Thomas's Hospital on the south bank, looking straight ahead at the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament. And towards the end of the day, again, Monet's eye picks up on the complementary colours of the orange, and here we've got blues and greens coming in. Of course, it doesn't look like that, but there's a hint of it if you're surrounded by the orange light glinting off the Thames River. And so here he exaggerates, I'm sure, but nonetheless it indicates his visual hypersensitivity. But what really attracted Monet to London was the smog. And I remember as a boy travelling on a bus, and there would be somebody from London Transport with a flaming torch walking in front of the bus in 1949, and there were these pea supers. It was something really to behold, as was this. And this is the same pea super, and this comes about when thousands of coal fires are lit as the dusk settles and the temperature drops. And Monet was absolutely fascinated, creating this otherworldly appearance of the Palace of Westminster. He went back to Paris after a sojourn of many months in London, in fact made several visits around 1900, 1899, 1900, 1901, went back with 68 canvases that he had done, none of which he was happy with, and he constantly complained how difficult it was to capture this lighting effect. But eventually he worked up some enough for exhibition, and he was helped in the sales of these by a sudden love of the French for the British. Improbable as though that sounds, it came about as a result of a state visit by Edward VII and Queen Alexandra to Paris in 1903, which presaged the Entente Cordiale of 1904, which led to a military alliance, which we'll talk about when we come to the First World War in the last talk. And because of a sudden love for all things British, all his paintings sold almost before the paint was dry. And here Monet is back in Giverny then, having successfully sold a lot of these paintings, spending a lot of money and time selecting plants for his lily pond, and then he sets to work. Before he went to London, some years earlier, his first construction, because he knew he was going to enlarge the pond, was a Japanese bridge based on a woodcut by Hiroshige that he'd seen in an exhibition in Paris. And this is a copy of Hiroshige's Japanese bridge there. But it's a super-saturated picture, isn't it? I mean, you don't know where to look first. It's super-saturated sensations. We've got trees in the background, willow trees reflected in the water, patches of water lilies, irises on the bank. You don't know where to look first. It absolutely overwhelms the senses. But now he was studying, he was going to make this his life's work now for the remainder of his life, his beloved lily pond. And here he does just a simple little sketch capturing the effect of the light on the rim of the water lily leaf. You remember how it turns up just at the edge. And now he's not so much interested in the detail, but just the way the light bounces off that rim there. And now, by omitting any reference to a horizon, he just looks at a patch of water with water lilies. You can see the reflection of the trees going down, occupying the center of the painting there, some water lilies in the foreground. But look at those 3 patches or 4 patches of water lilies going up from the right-hand margin up towards the top center of the picture there. It's almost as if they are free-floating in space. We know intellectually they are floating on water, but suspend your conditioning and just look at that. It looks as though they're floating in space. And this was his wonderful gift for light and creating that effect. And here he's rendered almost in abstract terms the same sort of scene as you can see. When Durand Ruel was absolutely bowled over by these and saying, Monet, Monet, we must exhibit these, he says, no, no, no. They are just an attempt at an experiment. But I must admit, Monsieur Durand Ruel, I think they are going to be among my best works. Eventually he did agree, and they were in fact sold. 3 rooms of his gallery were made available for these paintings, and of course they all sold. And Durand Ruel, who'd been on the brink of bankruptcy twice, paying out to these totally unknown artists, was finally able to get his just reward. Whilst in London during I think it was the Franco-Prussian wartime, he met a society English lady who just happened to have a palazzo on the Grand Canal in Venice. And she said, Monsieur Monet, it would be a great honor for me to entertain you and your wife in Venice, should you ever want to come. And he followed up on that and took Alice to and there he painted on the Grand Canal the same sort of thing, lots of pictures and different times of day. He went back, and this is a character trait in Monet that I hadn't really appreciated, and I'm not sure it's all that really worthy. Rather than give these paintings to the loyal Durand Ruel, who nearly went bust twice on account of his kindness to these young artists, he goes to a rival dealer and puts his Venice pictures in there. Because he had a good offer. It's just a little, I don't want to say too much because he's obviously a great man, but we're all imperfect. When they came back from Venice, Alice became very lethargic. A doctor was called, and it turned out that she had acute leukemia, and within 6 weeks she passed away. And as a result of that, Monet was totally paralyzed in what he could do. And he had a visit in his studio. The word had come around that Monet was in a bad state, understandably so. He was now nearly 80 years old. And he had a visit from this man with the little walrus moustache there and the funny hat and a walking stick. And that is Georges Clemenceau, the former Prime Minister of France, who interestingly was also qualified as a physician and at one time had been the editor of an art journal. And that's how he knew of Monet. And he admired his work very much, and he went to visit the depressed man in Giverny and said, Monet, you must get working again. You have so much to offer the world. Why not undertake with your beloved water lilies a project, and I will use my good offices to see that they are purchased on behalf of the French nation. And this perked him up enormously, as you could imagine. And he set to work. And he set to work doing numerous sketches of his water lilies with a view to a grand project that Clemenceau had encouraged him. But there was a problem. And I think you can see from the colouring here what the problem was. Monet had developed cataracts in both eyes, and as a consequence of cataract, blue light is filtered out, so there is an overrepresentation of browns and greens. And here are the water lilies now, and you can see everything looks a little bit muddy. And so he was a problem because he knew that things weren't quite as they should be, but nonetheless he had this project he couldn't refuse. Not only was his cataract filtering out the blue light, he was developing loss of acuity quite severely, particularly in one eye. So much so that here he is painting can you believe, the same Japanese bridge that we saw earlier, 27 years earlier. And this is the extent to which his eyesight had deteriorated. In order to paint at all that Monet could do was read the label close up of his tubes of paint, knowing that this was yellow ochre and this was something, something. And he arranged blobs of the paint all round his palette, and then by memory, knowing what was where, he could then he knew that he wasn't seeing things correctly, but he tried to compensate for that in that manner. But Clemenceau was concerned about him, and he says, Monet, you must have surgery and have your cataracts dealt with. Which he did. It didn't all go smoothly. He had some complications, but eventually it came right. He started with surgery on the right eye, and the right cataract was removed. And when you remove the lens of the eye, the normal human lens actually filters just a little bit of blue, the ultraviolet and a little bit of blue. And we interpret the blue as natural, but in fact the lens has filtered out some of those extreme end of the spectrum. And as a consequence of having his cataract removed and not replaced by something that filtered out a little bit of blue, blue was now overrepresented in his painting, so much so that it was actually quite painful for him to paint the blue. No doubt the ultraviolet light was coming through as well. And so here, go back to the ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist says to him, he was already 84 years old when he had his cataracts done, can you believe? So it's pretty heroic in 1924. And the ophthalmologist said, it's a well-known phenomenon, Monsieur Monet, don't worry. What we'll do is we'll fit you with a pair of spectacles, and for the eye that we've operated on, we'll give it just a little hint of yellow, which will compensate for the blue, the same degree of yellow that the natural lens filters out, so your color balance will be restored. Monet could see beautifully. He was very, very happy, and like a sensible man, he refused any surgery that wasn't absolutely necessary. And as a surgeon, I can say that. The ophthalmologist simply blacked out the other lens where the acuity was very poor and the cataract was very severe. And there is a picture of Monet at the age of 83, 84, painting these for his grand design, as he called it, the grand project that Clemenceau had promised him. He did many, many pictures way above what was needed for Clemenceau's promise of a dedicated space, and many of the water lily pictures have appeared in many museums around the world, and I'm sure you've seen them. But as far as Paris itself was concerned, Clemenceau was good to his word, and he secured the lower level of the Orangerie Gallery in Paris by the Place de la Concorde, 2 large rooms to be dedicated to the water lily series of Monet. And here they are, you can see in this sort of fisheye lens view, 14 of them, 7 in each room, to allow the viewer to immerse himself in Monet's world. Monet, health was deteriorating at this point. He had a chest infection which wouldn't get better. He had a chest x-ray done which showed one side of his thoracic cavity was completely with a pleural effusion and almost certainly an underlying carcinoma of the bronchus, lung cancer. He'd been a heavy smoker all his life. On a last visit to Monet in Giverny, Georges Clemenceau came to visit him knowing that he was a dying man, and slowly, slowly the two of them walked around his beloved lily pond, and that was the last time Monet went out. 2 weeks later he died and was buried in the churchyard next to Alice and Suzanne, her daughter, and all of France mourned. The person who was somewhat of a recluse, Paul Cézanne, knew of Monet. He didn't really interact very much with artists, but when asked about Monet, he said, "What did you think of Monet?" He says, "Monet is nothing but an eye. But mon Dieu, what an eye." But now, in light of a current neurophysiology, I think it's fair to add, and what a brain. Thank you.